The last lecture for Unit 3, and obviously then the last lecture for Chapter 8. And so this one is titled A History of Political Geography. And we're going to start with the Treaty of Westphalia. So go ahead and I'll give you just a minute to find your key term slide for the Treaty of Westphalia. Really, this is where modern political geography begins, because this is this is following the Hundred Years' War in Europe, and we start to see that these ethnic groups that are spread across Europe, they begin to think of themselves not only just ethnic groups, but they think of them as formal states. And so this is where we see modern state building. Okay, and so great example of the what comes out of the treaties of Westphalia would be the Kingdom of France. And so basically today, and it's very similar. The country, or the state of France. And at least initially, the Gauls and the Franks, they shared religion, they shared language, they shared very similar artifacts, sociofacts, and minifacts. And so, really, this is the treaty that ended the Hundred Years' War. This is where we start to see modern nation states. And so, we're going to see this in Spain and Portugal and England and some other places. But this is really kind of what starts modern state building. All right. Now, we've alluded to this one. I think we've talked about this one in class. But in terms of Africa, we talked about the Berlin Conference. And so let's kind of formally go over this one. One of the greatest impacts in the taking over of Africa by European states would be the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. And so the story kind of starts, and keep in mind that Europeans having influence in Africa had started in the late 1400s with the Portuguese, but really, for the most part, the Europeans up until the 1860s had kind of stuck to the coast. In other words, they hadn't really gone into the interior of Africa, and so really they had taken over coastal cities, port cities, but they really had not gone into the interior of Africa. And that really changes with the Belgians, and they discover resources in the Congo in the 1860s. And this really starts European countries having an interest in exploiting natural resources. Because you have to understand, at this time, the modern European powers that we see today, whether it's Spain, whether it's England, whether it's France, whether it's Belgium, whether it's the Netherlands, at about this time, they're all starting to industrialize, and they realize that if they get cheap raw materials, that's going to make their country really wealthy, because then they can take those cheap raw materials and they can turn them into manufactured goods, which adds value to those things. And so the kind of the scramble for colonies was on. And so then it got to the point where some of the Europeans were fighting over parts of Africa, and so they decided that they needed to have a conference or a get together to kind of hash out whose part of Africa was whose. And so you can see here in the picture, they've got the Africa cake there, and the European powers are kind of dividing it up as to what part belongs to each country. And the kind of the sad part about this is that no African people or no African country attended the conference. And then these borders that Europeans set for this conference, pretty much once the Europeans left in the 1950s and 60s, those more or less became the boundaries that we see today. And of course, these boundaries were not set up to help the people at all. A lot of times they crammed together ethnic groups that didn't like each other. Really, the borders were just created to help Europeans facilitate the exploitation of resources. And as those countries became independent, they didn't want to give up any land. And so instead of dividing the land up and making it kind of equal for one another, they all basically took what the Europeans had gave them. And, this has caused a lot of issues for countries in terms of some countries have a lack of resources, some countries have more than that. And, a good example we talked about in class would be Chad. Chad does have oil, but they have a lot of ethnic trouble. Remember, they're landlocked. These borders create more landlocked countries than any other continent, and they're paying for it as a result today. All right. So again, as we talk about a history of political geography, that's a good history of Africa. Most of the places that you see there, this is what they look like for a colony, and pretty much that's more or less what they look like today as states. And some of them changed a little bit, but that's pretty much how they came out as states. Okay, so really kind of a big picture focus for us during this particular PowerPoint is going to be the idea of geopolitics. So geopolitics is basically a strategic interest you have in a place and how you identify those places on Earth that are important for you to control. And the example I always like to use are the British, the United Kingdom, because they're really better at it than anybody. And what they decided in the 1800s was that they didn't really need to control a lot of land per se. They just needed to control strategic points. And so a lot of these were like choke points that we'll talk about what a choke point is later. But they just figured that they needed to control key ports, key cities, key areas of the earth, and they didn't have to spend a lot of time covering and controlling a lot of land. They just needed to control the key entry points to those places. And so, they were better at it than doing anything. And I'll give you an example. One of the places they identified that could control trade on a very big scale would be the Strait of Gibraltar. And so the Strait of Gibraltar being down, the little choke point that is between Spain and Morocco, where ships basically they have to go through there if they want to get in or out of the Mediterranean from the Atlantic Ocean or likewise. And so if you control that one spot that's like, just a few miles wide, then you control all of the trade that wants to go in and out of the Mediterranean, and that gives you a lot of power. And so geopolitics is all about identifying key places on Earth that you need to control, for your country in terms of giving you a strategic, maybe military or especially economic advantage. And so if you want another one besides the Strait of Gibraltar, you could talk about ones that you may know, including like the Panama Canal. This is, when the United States had the Panama Canal built in the early 1900s, they realized that if you wanted to have, efficient trade, you had to go through that one spot to get from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean or vice versa. Or you had to sail down around the tip of South America, which take you a week or two. Or you could try to go up around Canada, which would be virtually impossible, or you could unload your goods and go across land. So once you use the Panama Canal, that's going to cut down a lot of time and trade. It's going to save you a lot of money. You're going to make a lot of money in the long run. And so, like I said, Britain was really good at identifying those kind of spots around the world and then controlling them. And that's really the idea of what we call geopolitics. And then I think the other big thing that you want to understand is that this shapes a lot of what countries do in terms of their foreign policy. This shapes what they do in terms of interaction with other countries. And so if your country was identified by one of these European powers or by the United States as a strategic place of political importance, then your country is going to get taken over, or that particular city or that particular entrance is going to get taken over and it's going to impact you. And so, these kind of things, they shape wars. They shape foreign policy for years to come. Okay, so a couple of these that we kind of talked about. There you can see Gibraltar, which is that entrance to the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic Ocean. There you can see kind of what it looks like in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see that, the British, they took a look at where the port by the Gambia River was, and they didn't want to spend a lot of time putting their army or military way upriver there. All they needed to literally control was the entrance to that place. And so, like I said, they were really good at controlling those key strategic important places, and they could control a large area by just controlling a small space. Hong Kong was another one that they identified. A river comes out of Hong Kong, and as they controlled that became kind of their financial center in China, where they controlled the tea and opium trade. All right, and then there you can see some of the places around the world that at one point, at least, the United Kingdom controlled as of 1921. They don't control all these places now. Some of these places like Nigeria, South Africa, those places are independent. India. But at the time, this is what helped them to become the most powerful country in the 1800s. Okay, so I've kind of alluded to it, but let me talk about it more formally. When you control those strategic places that trade must pass through, that is what is called a choke point. So a choke point is a geopolitical place of strategic importance through which trade must pass. And when you control these, it gives you a tremendous amount of economic power over a broad area. You control all the trade that comes in and out of there. Think of how you could tax these, the ships that come in and out of there. And when countries depend upon global trade for their economy, that gives you a lot of power. And so there's a lot of very important ones. I'm going to point out the Strait of Malacca, which pretty much almost all important trade that goes from South Asia to East Asia and likewise goes through that one area right there by Singapore. This has made Singapore very rich, for a really small, tiny microstate. The Strait of Hormuz would be another good example of a choke point. The Strait of Hormuz is an area in which oil comes out of the Middle East, and it has to kind of go out that area. Another one would be like the Bosporus Straits. You can kind of see it's called the Turkish Straits, but the formal name for it is the Bosporus Straits. The Suez Canal, again, giving access from places that sell oil to the Mediterranean. And then, of course, probably the most famous one in the Western Hemisphere would be the Panama Canal. And that allows you easy access between the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean. All right, so now we're going to get into these geopolitical theories. So just know that each one of these was a geopolitical theory in which the major countries around the world used to kind of shape foreign policy, and really some of these led to world wars happening because they were scrambling, trying to get control of these various areas. And so the first one is called the Heartland Theory, and this comes from a British kind of foreign policy maker and really he was a geographer too. And the idea that came from Mackinder said that, who rules East Europe commands the heartland. The heartland was important, let me tell you guys, because that is where at the time, these countries that were industrializing, that's where they believed the vast amount of iron ore and coal were. And iron ore and coal make steel. Coal is a form of fuel during the industrial age. And so if you control that heartland, and let me just kind of show you what the heartland looks like. Okay, and so if you control that heartland, you really control the vast majority of the world's wealth. And there was this kind of conspiracy theory by the British that the Russians and the Germans were going to unite together, and that they were going to, between the two of them, control the heartland. And that meant that they would become the world's powers. And so it was kind of the job of the British, at least in their idea, to keep that heartland kind of divided so that they would have access to it. All right. And so that is the heartland theory. And so, you're going to write down this definition, and then I'll give you the examples. The heartland theory is the idea that all the great coal and iron deposits necessary for industrialization were located in the heartland, or what is called by Mackinder the pivot area. And you can just know it as the heartland. You don't need to know it as the pivot area. From a timeline perspective, you need to know that this was, before 1914. And so really, this is one of the theories that helps lead to World War I, because as the British, as the Germans, as the Russians are all kind of scrambling for the world's resources, whoever controls those world resources is going to be the preeminent world power. And so everybody wanted to control the heartland, and World War I really starts in a way over fighting over that heartland. And then, of course, any of you that know stuff about World War I, you know that all they needed was an excuse to go to war with each other to kind of scramble over that heartland. And that becomes the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Once that happens, all the countries have all the excuse they need to go to war with each other, and then the scramble over the heartland commences. Okay. All right. And so that's what I was kind of talking about. Mackinder identified the geopolitical nightmare that was to haunt the world's two sea powers during the first half of the 20th century, Great Britain, and later on the United States. The nightmare was if Germany or Russia were allowed to control Eastern Europe, this could lead to the domination of the Eurasian landmass by one of these two powers as a prelude of mastery to the world. And again, mostly this has to do with if you can control that, really you were the main industrial power. And really at this time, we didn't know that there was a lot more coal and iron ore out there, especially in like the United States. But you got to understand this is in the context of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and this was the political view that shaped foreign policy. Okay. Now we're going to fast forward a little bit. So now we're going to talk about kind of the time between World War I and World War II. And so what we started to understand as time is moving on is that controlling the heartland actually was too big of a job. I mean, controlling the Eurasian landmass was a very difficult thing for one country to do. And so really what countries started doing is they started focusing on key seaports, right? And so, like Venice, Athens, these places that were, key seaports where if you controlled those places, Istanbul, Turkey would be another one, uh, Shanghai, any of these places that are kind of along the coast of what we're calling now the Rimland. So it's basically just like the Heartland theory, but now we're going to focus it on the coast. Okay, so the difference between the two is that instead of controlling kind of the inner mass of the Eurasian landmass, now you want to control the key coastal areas of what is called the Rimland, which is the Eurasian landmass. And again, no time-wise that this is a pre-World War II geopolitical strategy, and that this was the example of that is foreign policy of the British during this time. And that's probably good enough. You don't need to have a great example for this one. Okay, the next geopolitical theory of importance is actually our geopolitical theory called the domino theory. Now, in terms of a context, this is happening after World War II. And if you don't know too much about World War II, right after World War II, Eastern European starts to get controlled. They're very unstable economically, and so it's ripe for revolutions. And the dominant groups in most of the Eastern European countries are going to be communist governments. So communist governments are going to take control in almost every Eastern European country, and they are backed by the Soviet Union, which is kind of the communist country. And the problem why we don't like communism is mostly because as an economic system, it's a self-sufficient system. It's a system in which they don't seek to trade with the outside world. And you got to understand that we as a we as a capitalist country, our economy is capitalist. The goal is really to sell with as many countries as possible. And so every country that turns to communist is one less country that we can sell with. And that's harmful to our economy. And so we're trying to prop up these vulnerable countries around the world that we feel are being threatened to fall to communism, because that's going to hurt our economy, and we want to have a very strong, robust economy. And so you have two places, really three, that we'll talk about, that the American government, the foreign policy makers of America and you can write down the time period here, from roughly 1945 to probably 1991. 1991 is when most of the communist governments fall. But that 50-year period in which we believe that if we allow countries to fall to the economic system of communism, that it's possible that their next door neighbor might fall, and then their next door neighbor might fall, just like a line of dominoes. And so you can see there, the idea was if Vietnam falls to communism, then like a domino, that'll bleed over into Laos, a neighboring country, and then another neighboring country into Cambodia. And to some degree, this pretty much happens. We see this with the Soviet Union, in which from the Soviet Union, communism goes into China. And then we see it start to go into Korea, into North Korea, and then the North Koreans attack South Korea and try to turn South Korea into communist. And so those are the dominoes that we're worried about. And so in both cases, we go to Korea and try to stop that in the 1950s. And then, of course, in the 1960s and early 1970s, we fight the war in Vietnam. So those are two examples you could use for the domino theory. We get involved in the Korean War in the 1950s. We get involved in the Vietnam War in the 1960s and 70s to stop the advance of the dominoes, to stop the advance of communism. We could also talk about Cuba, but I think you guys have enough examples for the domino theory. Okay, and I don't know how much of this you need to write down, but just know that communism is kind of like the opposite idea of capitalism, whereas capitalism is very minimal government help or aid or interference into the economy. When you're talking about communism, it's total control over what is produced, how much is produced, how much to charge for it, whereas capitalism, it's a very free system, which you decide what to produce. If it doesn't sell, then you go out of business. Whereas communism, if the government decides that something is valuable that needs to be produced, even if you're not a very good business, they'll kind of keep you going because that's what needs to be produced. And so we'll kind of talk about the difference between those systems, but just know that, it was a threat. At least our government thought it was a threat to our economic system. And that's why they fought in far off places like Vietnam and Korea to stop it. Okay, and again, time frame for this one, 1945 really to probably 1991 when the Soviet Union falls. Okay, and here's kind of what it looks like. You can see in Korea, there's where we kind of drew the line in the sand, created that demilitarized zone by about 1953, and that's where we stopped the advance of communism. Same thing in Vietnam. You have the 17th parallel, which is where we stopped the advance of North Vietnam, at least for a time. And then, if you don't know this, by the early 1970s, we decided it wasn't worth fighting in Vietnam. We left, and then the North Vietnamese pretty much went in and conquered South Vietnam. And then, really until recently, and I'm talking about the last 10 years or so, ever since 1975, Vietnam has been a communist country. They're slowly starting to work their way out of that. I would say they're starting to become more capitalist. They still have a lot of government control in their economy, but it was a big loss for us. We really got our clocks cleaned in Vietnam. Okay, balance of power. I'm going to say, hey, if you want to do this one, fine. If you don't feel like doing this, just know what a balance of power is. And a balance of power just means that you have two very evenly matched sides or two very evenly matched countries. And the threat of going to war with each other is so great. And everybody knows that the catastrophe will be so big that it actually stops war from happening. And so after World War II, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, those are your two examples you're going to use, creates a balance of power that creates the threat of World War III to be so, such a negative thing in the minds of all of these countries that they're not willing to do it. And so they know that if one country attacks, it's going to erupt into a huge world mess, and it's going to be bad for everybody. And so this actually stops war. And that's what foreign policy makers were trying to do during what the era known as the Cold War, from the 1940s to early 1991, is create this balance of power between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, Western Europe versus Eastern Europe. And that way we wouldn't go to war again. And really, you could say it was kind of successful. Okay. On to the idea of colonization. Now, in class, I covered the idea of what is colonization, what's imperialization. But if you don't have that, let me give that to you kind of quickly. We talked about in at least two of my classes the idea of what colonization and imperialization was. So colonization is when one country, to take over the resources of another area, they kind of claim it as theirs. And typically colonization is seen as when you go to a place that's relatively uninhabited, or sparsely inhabited by human beings. You claim it as that other country, and then you get the spoils of it. You get the resources that come out of that. In Africa, we would see this more as what we would call imperialism. So if we were going to do an example for colonization, we'd say, all right, we're going to go to Antarctica, we find gold or whatever, and we lay claim to it for the United States. That would be colonization. And then, companies would come in, and the idea would be that people would come in there and they would take over that area. But in imperialism, we need to understand that there's a population already there, and it's an established population. What I mean by that is they already have a government, they already have a social structure, they already have an economic structure. And with imperialism, you have a country come in and basically take that area over. And so I'm going to use Nigeria for imperialism. The British came in and they took over Nigeria and they controlled it. And they made the people start to learn English. They tried to convert them to Christianity. And they tried to create a capitalist system in which the British made most of the economic rules. And they did this until 1960. And then after that, then they left. They decided, well, this probably wasn't the nicest thing to do. And they, as you can see with a lot of other European countries, whether it was the French colonies of Algeria, Mali, Mauritania, whether it was the British colonies of like Ghana and Nigeria, South Africa, Botswana, or perhaps some of the Belgian ones like the Congo, really at about the 1960s, the European countries realized kind of some of the errors of their ways, and they decide to end their imperialist rule. And so in the 1960s, we really have a period of what is called decolonization. And so decolonization is the process by which those former colonies or imperialistically controlled countries like a Nigeria or like Algeria or like Mali, they become independent states. And so really for Africa, I'd say most of those, if you looked on the map, they go through their period of decolonization in the 1960s. And unfortunately, a lot of these places, they had a really unstable situation in terms of economically, in terms of ethnically. The Europeans made the ethnic groups kind of just shut up and play nice. And once the Europeans left, then those ethnic groups, they kind of renewed their long-seated hatred of each other. And I think one of the most famous examples of this is Rwanda. Once the Belgians left, than the Rwandans by the 1990s. They had really devolved into a pretty ugly, massive civil war. And so decolonization is kind of a good and a bad thing. It's a good thing because now they become independent states, but without kind of the guidance of the European countries, ethnic conflicts come to the surface, fights over land. Not all these groups get along and have the same vision. And so it's really kind of an ugly process. And I'd say that, the African countries are still dealing with some of the fallout of what the Europeans did to them, starting with the Berlin Conference and ending with the period of decolonization. All right. So when we say a vacuum for power, it means, well, hey, look, they don't have traditions of democracy. Nobody trusts elections. And usually what you got in these countries were strongmen, people that controlled the military. And so if you were like the lead general, you became the president of that particular country. A great example of this would be Uganda. So if you've ever heard of Idi Amin was the head general of the army. And he basically nominated himself to be president, became president for many years until he was eventually assassinated. Okay. All right. So that should be it in terms of the things you need to know for not only Chapter 8, but also for Unit 3. What I'm going to do is I'm going to post all of my PowerPoints in the Week 19 folder that you might need for Chapter 8. And then, if you haven't watched any of my video lectures from last week, make sure you go back and do those and just kind of go through your list to make sure you have all your key term slides that you'll need for the test next week. Okay. Thank you for tuning in. Have